The next option we will discuss is recurring invoices on a separate frequency than the job. This is a great option when the billing frequency is not the same as the service frequency, or when the customer prepays or would like to be on a payment plan. For example, if a customer has a quarterly service but would like to be billed monthly, or if you would like to set them up on a monthly payment plan, you can set up their billing parameters like this. First, we'll create a quarterly service on our calendar, and this job will be for Tom. And then we're going to choose our quarterly service. By default, the invoice will repeat every 3 months with each job. So since we want to bill this customer monthly, we're going to edit the invoice frequency, and we're going to set it to repeat on a different frequency than the job. So in this case, it's going to be monthly. And much like the job frequency, you have the option to have the invoice end on a specific date, or after X number of invoices, or end never. Recurring invoices on a separate frequency than the job will also have an assigned action. These invoices can automatically send by email and CC another billing contact on the account, charge to a credit card saved on file, and charge the credit card and send a receipt automatically. The action will trigger based on the invoice date or date issued, and will continue to trigger based on the frequency assigned. If the invoice date is the current date or a date in the past, the action will trigger immediately. So in this case, if we set the date issued to be today, which is the 31st, and we save, first thing we'll see is that the invoice will repeat monthly on the last Wednesday because of the date issued that we set. And since it's the current date, we'll have the option to perform the action or perform the first action immediately, or you can complete this later, which will keep that invoice in draft. Okay, and if we chose that option, it would just continue to repeat every month on the last Wednesday and automatically send by email. If you set the invoice date in the future, the invoice will stay attached to the job in draft status until the action is scheduled to trigger. So in this case, the invoice will stay in draft status attached to this quarterly service while being scheduled to send out monthly on the first Tuesday. And that's because of the date issued that we set. Okay, so now if we open up the customer's account, and we view their invoice list, here you'll see the draft invoice, okay, as well as the next upcoming invoice based on its frequency. So this is the current invoice in draft that will automatically send out on April 6th. And then moving forward, the next invoice will be on May 4th. And that is because the invoice is set to repeat monthly on the first Tuesday. So think of this almost as a queue, right? So this one has not generated because the upcoming date hasn't hit yet. Once it does generate, it will create its own invoice number and the action will trigger immediately. Okay. When an invoice is set up on its own frequency separate than the job, any changes to the job will not affect the invoice. Okay, so that is one thing to keep in mind. So if we were to, for example, reschedule the date of this job to a different day, that will have no effect on the invoice since the invoice is still on its own frequency. So the invoice in this case will still repeat monthly on the first Tuesday. Using recurring invoices on a separate frequency than the job is a great method for handling prepaid customers. For example, if a customer would like to pay for the year in advance for their monthly service, you can set the job to repeat monthly, then edit the invoice to repeat yearly. So for example, we'll go back to our calendar and we're going to create a new job for Jess. And we're going to choose our service, which will be monthly service. And as we know, by default, the invoice is going to repeat monthly with each job. However, in this case, we actually want the invoice to repeat yearly, since the customer paid for the year in advance. So we're going to change the frequency to yearly. We can set the price here, since this will be for the whole year. And then we're going to choose our date issued. So just for this example, we'll say the customer paid today, which is March 31st, and then their service will start on April 6th. Okay, so I'm going to change the date issued to the current date. And then you'll see in the summary that this invoice is going to repeat yearly on the last Wednesday of March. And that's because we've scheduled the date issued to the last Wednesday of March. If we wanted it to be on a specific date, you can change it from day of the week to day of the year. And then that way it'll be on March 31st yearly, regardless of what day of the week that falls on. Okay, for this example, we'll just change it back to day of the week. All right, and then we're just going to choose our action. Okay, so in this case, you can do two things. You can set it to send by email, and since it's the date issued, since the date issued is today and we click save, you will have the option to trigger the action immediately or complete it later. So you could complete this later and then add a payment afterwards once it's in draft, or you can just set the action to none and then save, which will keep that invoice in draft status. Okay, so now since the customer has already paid, we want to add a payment right away. So we're going to add our payment. And this customer paid by a check. So we'll add a payment. Okay, so now this monthly service is going to have this paid invoice that will automatically send out on the last Wednesday of the year, each year. So it will continue to repeat on its own frequency. And if we were to complete this job for April 6th, and then jump ahead to Jess's new job next month, is right here, we'll see that the job will keep repeating on the calendar every month, but it will keep this paid invoice attached all the way until it's triggered to send out on the last Wednesday of March the following year. So this is a great method for setting up a payment plan.